Dit is my so lekker om vanoggend weer met Richard Hay te gesels. Hy's 'n kurator by die Future Africa Indigneous and Orphan Crops Collection verbonde aan die Universiteit van Pretoria. Richard, welcome back to GROOTplaas.
Thank you. Very glad to be back.
I hear that since we've spoken last, that you guys have just had the most amazing, people inspired by what you guys are doing. How does that feel?
That's been incredible. The publicity that we receive through GROOTplaas and the number of people that have reached out wanting to be part of the project has been incredible. And we're hoping to carry that on.
It's always wonderful when people are doing good work, and then you shouldn't be surprised when there's positive feedback. Now, let's talk about the large-scale, when we talk about aloes. What inspired you to spearhead this large-scale Magaliesberg aloe almost reintroduction? What's the thought behind that, or the dream?
So, on top of my job at the University of Pretoria, I'm also the regional coordinator for the Botanical Society of South Africa, and that's a volunteer-based organization for people wanting to know, grow, protect, and enjoy South Africa's indigenous plants.
Yeah.
And so we're all about getting communities active in preserving our natural heritage. I'm also a hobbyist aloe breeder, so aloes are one of my passions. The Magaliesberg aloe pegloray is a local endemic, so it's only found on the Magaliesberg and a smaller little satellite population on the Witwatersrand. So it really represents our grassland ecosystems around here. And so it's one of the key species that we wanted to actively play a role in preserving.
What is it about aloe that makes you so excited? I mean, obviously you're doing it because it gives something back.
Yeah, I've always been drawn to aloes. I think they're such an iconic genus in South Africa. Everyone knows an aloe.
Yeah.
And they really represent, I think, South Africa's biodiversity. They're incredibly tough. They are found across the country. We are the center of diversity for this genus. So yeah, there's just something about them that really appeals to me.
Are they endangered? Let me rather ask, why are they critically endangered, and what are the factors what are the threats?
So aloe pegloray is critically endangered. It's quite a niche specialist, so it's only found on these north-facing slopes at the top of the Magaliesberg, so quite a small range. But because of its adaptations to this very specialized, harsh climate, it's very slow growing. And the biggest threat is actually people removing mature plants out of the wild for their gardens. It's a very impressive looking plant in the middle of winter when everything else is dead. It sends out a really large red inflorescence. And it's a stunning aloe, but a very poor garden plant. It doesn't do well in gardens, but despite that, it is still removed, and that's led to the decline.
Yeah. Are you guys worried about that?
Yeah, we are incredibly concerned about the species. It's been ongoing since at least the 80s. This species has been in steady decline. And it's why we felt that we need to step in and play an active role in getting those numbers up out in the wild again.
If we look practically at a project like this, this is large scale. It can't be done with just 5 or 6 people. Everybody's got to buy in, right? Especially if you want to make a difference. So explain to me, how did the collaboration with the Botanical Society of South Africa, but also other organizations, how did that come to be?
Yeah, it's quite a complex undertaking, this large-scale project.
Yeah.
Our first starting point was our friends at the aloe farm, Andy DeVet and Quinton Bean. We've been long-standing personal friends with them. We also get a lot of plants from their collections for the university. They are situated just outside Brits, and so they have aloe pegloray on their farm, and they are committed to preserving the species. And so they started collecting seed and growing out seedlings, to provide a sustainable alternative to people who want aloe pegloray in their collections and their gardens, so they're not harvesting from the wild. But they also wanted to see seedlings return to the wild, and so they offered us around 10,000 seedlings just under 2 years ago, with the condition that we as the Botanical Society would then ensure that those seedlings are returned to habitat. We used the University of Pretoria's Marnie van der Schuyf Botanical Garden as our sort of coordination point. Being a botanical garden, we have the skills, we have access to students who are keen to volunteer, and we can open our doors to members of the wider public who want to volunteer. And then our starting point for the reintroduction itself was just outside Mamelodi, on that edge of the Magaliesberg, with a traditional healer that we work with, Dr. Ephraim Abena. He has been custodian of that mountain for just over 20 years.
Wow.
It used to be a dumping site. He had a dream. His father came to him and said, "You need to protect this space." And for the last 20 years, he's dedicated his life to preserving that ecosystem. And so we felt that this was a perfect starting point because it's the historical range of this aloe. But secondly, to have a local custodian who's engaged with the community, who's providing a safe, intact habitat for the species, was a good place to start off the replanting.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, many players in this game, but yeah, ultimately we're here now.
For somebody who might not know, how does a reintroduction like this look like? Do you bring plants back? Is the focus bringing more plants and planting them and just giving them a new home?
Yes, so we've grown out the seedlings that were donated by the Aloe Farm in our greenhouses at the University of Pretoria. Those seedlings are now roughly just bigger than a R5 coin and are, we think, big enough to go out. One of our colleagues is doing his PhD on best practices of reintroducing Aloe pregulae. So with that scientific data, we've now developed this little protocol that we then teach our volunteers, and they physically do plant out seedlings back into habitat. So
That's amazing.
It's not necessarily the most complex work, it's just a lot of hands in the felt playing a part.
But I also think a lot of education goes with this, because you can now reintroduce and replant. I'm sure that education is a big part of this for you guys as well, because everybody needs to know the importance of what you're doing.
100%. So when our volunteers come in, we teach them about the aloe. We want to, ideally, with this first population that we've reintroduced, develop educational signage, have school tours, and educate as many South Africans as possible about this aloe and the wide environment. It's not just limited to this particular species. It's just a good starting point to initiate those conversations and raise awareness.
Yeah. And if we look a little bit into the future, how would a successful project like this look to you guys? What would that picture look like?
So ideally, 8 to 10 years' time, the plants that we've planted since November will be mature, will start flowering, will produce their own seed, and that seed will then recruit the next generation of young Aloe pregulae in the space. And if we get to that point, it'll be the first time since at least the 80s that an Aloe pregulae has flowered on that side of the Magaliesberg.
You mentioned that the aloe, this specific aloe, it's not a good garden plant. How do you guys determine a specifically perfect, suitable planting site? How does that process work?
So, like I mentioned, our colleague Arnold Frisbee is doing his PhD on these plants. So he's done a lot of scientific studies over the last 2 years, looking at orientation relative to grasses, position on the slope itself. So we're drawing on that early scientific data to inform us. For Aloe pregulae specifically, they like north-facing slopes, very shallow, well-drained soil. And so very specific, very harsh conditions.
Yes.
But that's good for them, that's what they like, and it's why they make a poor garden plant.
Yeah, I hear you. I think when we look at the role that volunteers and just normal people play in a process like this, because at the end of the day, we're looking for sustainability. Otherwise, it's just going to, end in a year or so and as if nothing happened. So what role does volunteers specifically and the general public play in a project like this?
So throughout the whole project, from receiving the seedlings from the Aloe Farm all the way to planting them out to Dr. Mabena, volunteers and specifically people who aren't formally trained in botany and horticulture have been critical to this project. They have been the ones that have repotted the seedlings into bigger growing trays. They've looked after the seedlings, and they are now the ones returning the seedlings to the wild. So we as the plant experts offer guidance and we give the training and the small skills development that's needed. But ultimately, for these projects to work, like you say, it needs to involve communities and provide skills development, actually. We want more South Africans to learn something, to have a good experience.
Absolutely.
And be involved in something very tangible.
Yes, and there's nothing better than making a difference in your immediate surroundings, because at the end of the day, it's, nature around us it's got to stay. No, sure. I'm also thinking, when you sit back and you think about challenges when it comes to a project like this, what are some of the key challenges faced when it comes to ensuring the longevity and the sustainability of a project like this?
So the biggest thing for us is long-term safety of the aloes themselves.
Yeah.
Obviously, we still haven't fully addressed the poaching issues around these plants. And so we'd really encourage anyone out there who is gardening and looking to start a garden, if you are buying plants, buy them from reputable growers who aren't harvesting from the wild. There are a number of ways to assess that, but there's also a lot of resources online, and it's something the Botanical Society puts information out about. We want to see more South Africans engaged in their local green spaces and taking ownership of even local parks and that, and playing an active role in preserving all forms of green spaces. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a complex project like the Aloe Pregulae one. Just getting actively involved in your community, taking ownership, coming together. We can't wait for government to fix all of our parks. Some of us have to get in there and weed it ourselves.
Yeah. I think when we talk about the benefits of this specific aloe species, I can't help wondering, you know, why fight for a plant like this, for its, you know, ongoing sustainability? Why? What's the big benefits?
So I personally believe that all life has a right to exist. It doesn't necessarily have to have a benefit for us. There are much wider benefits that are quite complex to look at. Aloe Pregulae specifically is quite a keystone species in its habitat. It flowers late in winter when there's not much food out there. So it's an incredibly important food source for birds and small mammals and insects within its habitat. But like I said, South Africa is blessed with some of the most rich biodiversity in the world. Everyone's well aware of the fynbos, but actually every other biome in South Africa is just as important and almost as species rich. And particularly our grasslands, which are incredibly undervalued. A lot of people view them as just empty felt.
Empty space, yes.
But it's not. It's a very rich living ecosystem and a very unique ecosystem. And I believe that that's part of our national identity, of our national heritage. And as South Africans, in the same way that we support the Springboks and support the Proteas, the actual sports teams, we should also be supporting the ecosystems from which those plants and animals derive their names from.
That is very profound. That really is profound. Tell me, how does this project compare to similar projects like this in the wider South Africa?
So there are actually quite a few restoration projects around South Africa. This, as far as we know, is the only one centered on aloes. But like I said, it's something we want to see more of. A lot of the times we see nature as something separate from us that we shouldn't be involved in, but actually we are a part of the ecosystem itself. And particularly for something like Aloe Pregulae, where the threat is us removing mature specimens, we can flip that on its head and say, well, we can actively return these plants and get them stable again and reintroduce them to where they previously existed. We've done this with animals, so things like rhinos have been shifted around to new game parks to return them to their habitat. Plants aren't as mobile as animals, but we can make them mobile and we can return them to their ancestral homes.
Where does your passion for projects like this come from? Because obviously it had to, something had to stir your heart for you to, I almost want to be a voice for the voiceless. It's not really that, but something had to stir you to be so passionate about this.
I grew up around my grandfather, who was really passionate about plants. He was a maize breeder and maintained huge vegetable gardens, and that's how I got into the Orphan and Indigneous crops. My interest specifically from the ecological perspective is that I think horticulture can play a vital role in addressing conservation and ecological issues, and it can create a number of opportunities, not just job opportunities, but also just participation opportunities.
Absolutely.
I think as a society, we're very fragmented, and having projects in green spaces where everyone benefits can help bring people together and just understand the beauty of nature. I'm obviously obsessed with the natural world, and I think there's something for everyone. The diversity of plant life, specifically in South Africa, makes it such that if you are interested in food plants, there's something for you. If you are interested in medicine, there's something for you. If you are interested in the aesthetics of greenery, there's something for you as well. And so I think it's an easy way to connect people, bring people together, and get people inspired. I think there's something very motivating about greenery that gets people fired up and wanting to contribute.
Well, I absolutely feel it. Thank you, Richard. Goodness. I'm always so glad that there's people like you guys. Thanks for your time this morning. I really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.